Welcome to Wine on One, everyone. Today we're going to talk about sparkling wine. We figured no better way than the old Napoleonic ritual of a celebratory opening of a bottle of bubbles. So we're going to attempt to do it today. Nothing up my sleeves. A beautiful bottle of beach bubbles, a gorgeous saber, and we're going to open it in a very traditional way in France. 1, 2, 3. And there you have it. Nice clean cut. Welcome everyone to Wine 101. This is our June edition. 2020, fresh off of the COVID-19 phase 2 reopening for JOLO, which we're super happy and thrilled. So we're celebrating in multiple ways today. So we just got through sabering, opening up a beautiful bottle of bubbles, which I mentioned earlier. They think it's a Napoleonic tradition. Nobody really quite knows for certain. It's one of those traditions that are steeped in lore, and no one's really quite sure, but that's what I love about wine. There's no product that's more romantic than wine. We talked about the traditions of port wine and the tradition of champagne today and opening it, which is quite a treat if you're able to pull it off. People go, ooh, it's a lot of fun at a party if you nail it. A lot of practice. So champagne, sparkling wine, Prosecco, perhaps. So there's a lot of different names for sparkling wine. It's one of those beautiful things where you just know by the name sparkling wine, it's going to be fun. So that's why they christen ships, brand new ships, because what says celebration more than sparkling wine and champagne? So every new ship is christened with a bottle of champagne, not a bottle of Budweiser, not a bottle of tequila, but wine. So as we know, the Inophile's on with us today, that we cannot call in America or other parts of the world sparkling wine champagne unless it's from Champagne, France. There's a few reasons you can if you're grandfathered in and you were using it and selling it under that name prior, but a lot of organizations, especially in Napa and Sonoma, they've basically thrown the gauntlet down and said, you know, we could do it, but out of respect, we're still going to just call it sparkling instead of champagne, leaving it for the Champagne region of France where those bubbles come from. And in Champagne, they have a traditional method called the Méthode de Champenois, or Méthode de Traditionnelle, which basically means it's the traditional way they've made champagne for over 500 years. So Napoleon, that was 1789. And the lore goes that they would throw all the hussars, the soldiers of Napoleon, the champagne as they came back from the glorious victories, and they had nothing to open the champagne with, so they just pull the sword out, and to impress the ladies, they'd saber it, and that's how they would drink it. So they didn't carry a glass, they didn't carry a corkscrew or a bottle opener, they couldn't really open it other than with a saber on their horse. And Madame Vive Clicquot, who was a widow, only 27 years old when she inherited the estate and Champagne, they said it was to impress her, that they were all trying to woo her over because she was one of the wealthiest widows in France and she owned a champagne house. So a lot of great tradition. So in that region in Champagne, the traditional method is they take wine that's turned into wine. So as we know, we add yeast to the grape juice or the must, and the yeast attack the sugars, eat the sugars, convert the sugar to alcohol. And in that process, one of the byproducts of that process is the yeast send off little CO2 bubbles, so little CO2 farts. So yeast farts, if you will. And so what happens is that normally gets dissipated in the winery, in the tanks, it's released. We have CO2 valves, release valves in the tanks, or open top fermenters. It just goes up into the ethers, and you really don't have to worry about it. So what they did in France, in Champagne, they figured, what if we captured those and let it sit in a bottle, what would happen to the wine? So in that traditional method, what they do is they take still wine, and in each individual bottle, they'll put a little bit of sugar and a little bit of yeast called a liqueur. So that liqueur goes into the bottle, and then they put a cap like this bottle cap on the wine, which is still wine, and then they'll take it and put it into the cellar. And what happens is the yeast, as we just described, eats the sugar. And that CO2 gas is released, and that CO2 gas has no place to go. So it stays trapped in the bottle, and some bottles vary, but usually it's 8 or 9 atmospheres in one of these bottles, so it's very, very high pressure in Champagne. Prosecco is about half of that. Our beach bubbles and twinkles are about half of that. We'll explain why in a moment. So all that atmospheric pressure gets trapped, and the CO2, that pressure gets trapped in the bottle, has no place to go. And then what happens is the yeast have nothing left to eat, so they perish and they fall to the bottom of the bottle. And then what will happen is they'll take these bottles and they'll put them in what's called riddling racks in Champagne. So they're sitting at about this angle in a wood rack, looks like an A-frame or a sandwich sign. And someone will come through every day and riddle it a quarter turn, go through the riddling racks, quarter turn every day, just like this. And what that does, it takes all the spent yeast, which is called lees, all that spent yeast, it gets it from the punt of the bottle to the neck of the bottle. And that could happen for multiple years in the cellar. That's why vintage champagnes, you maybe just saw released a few months ago in February, January, beautiful 2016 Cristal from Louis Roederer. So many years in the cellar. And what that does is with the yeast and the lees, it goes through what's called autolysis and adds a creamy texture to the wine, or champagne now at this point, now that it's sparkling, and it's unfiltered. So the only way they filter it is by this careful process of riddling and getting all of that down to the bottom. So this is all clarified. And then they'll take it and reel it in or wheel it into a disgorging room, and they'll take this neck and dip it into liquid nitrogen. It'll freeze that neck, which is now called a plug, and they will take it carefully and pop this off, and the pressure will push that frozen plug of dead yeast and sediment out, and then they'll put in what's called a dosage, which is more wine and a little bit of sugar. So most champagnes are not bone dry. They're usually maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 grams per liter of sugar, and that's just to offset the high acidity from the early harvesting of the grapes, the harshness of the CO2 gas of the bubbles. So to balance that out so it doesn't taste like soda water, they put a little bit of sugar in. So that's called a dosage. And then they'll put the cork in and the crown. That's why champagne is so darn expensive, especially if it's a vintage. So in 1895, this gentleman, Federico Martinotti from the Asti region, you know Asti Spumante is a sparkling, so the Asti region. So he decided, that is fantastic, I love the way they do it, but it's a lot of work. So he came up with a method, which in some regions they still call it the Martinotti method, but it since has become called and named more commonly the Charmat method, because Eugene Charmat in 1907 perfected the whole filtering process and really took from Martinotti, the process, I'll describe it in a moment, and amplified it and made it more technically sound and easier for wineries to replicate year after year, and he got the patent. So it's now called a Charmat. But even though Martinotti is the father of this process. So the process I just described in Champagne, instead of it being done in bottle by bottle, what Martinotti did is he did that process in a giant tank. So like one of our tanks here at JOLO. So maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 gallon tank, puts the wine in, puts the sugar, puts the yeast, seals it up, and the yeast go to work, and all that pressure stays in the tank. You need a high pressure tank for this to take place. All that pressure is in the tank, and you bottle from the tank. That's called the Charmat method. So that's a technique that we employ here to make the beautiful beach bubbles and the twinkles. So what's really good about that process and why Prosecco has become such a fast-growing category in the wine world is because it's so easy to drink, it's fruity, it maintains a lot of the fruit process because it doesn't sit for years and years in the cellar, and you get the freshness and the liveliness of the acid and a little bit less of the bubbles, so you're really able to enjoy the nose, because with champagne, which I love, you can't really get the beautiful aromatics because the CO2 gas is so harsh. What it does is it stings your nose. So you have to kind of almost pull away, and you can't really enjoy the beautiful, delicate aromatics of the white grapes that are in, or the beautiful rosé style with our twinkles. So that is Wine 101 with champagne and sparkling wine, or Prosecco and the Charmat method versus the Méthode de Champenois.